Wouldn't it be nice to get some reasonable answers provided by the apologists to honest skeptics? And I say nice because we're never going to get any of that. The religious don't have anything remotely reasonable in their arsenal, but I'd really love it if we could see some rational answers to the questions that we pose to the religious. So, think we're going to see any of that today? Yeah, I don't either, but stay tuned because, hey, you never know. I'm starting to look for theists who think that they have reasonable answers, specifically for skeptics, and honestly, it's been harder than you'd think. Because these people, they really don't want to talk to us. And when they pretend, it's clear that they don't even know what skepticism is or what skeptics are actually looking for. Therefore, today we're going to dive into an old video that says it can provide reasonable answers to honest skeptics. And that would be an honest surprise because I don't think these people have the slightest clue what the hell they're talking about. So let's go see what Evangelism Explosion has to say, because I'm not thinking it's going to be very impressive.
The more we share our faith, the more likely we are at some point to encounter an objection or a tough question.
I honestly wish that I could say the same thing. The religious seem convinced that they pose hard questions for atheism, but in reality, they never do they? They never, ever do. Mostly, in my experience, and I'm sure you've seen this too, they're talking around their problems and they're not directly addressing them. Because when I ask the religious how they know these things that they claim to know, and how they've objectively tested any of it to see if it stands up to any kind of critical scrutiny, they have no answers. Oh, they'll hem and they'll haw and they'll make believe, but they can't just present their rationale in any demonstrable, evidence-based way. I want them to show their work, and they simply can't do that. Because, again, I don't accept double standards. There's one standard, it works for everything else, we're going to use it for this too. You haven't shown me why your imaginary friend deserves to be treated any differently than anything else does. Because until you can, I'm not going to make exceptions just because you really wish it was true. But sure, go ahead and show us your reasonable answers. I'm betting they're not really that reasonable.
And one of the more common objections is, I don't believe in God. When a person asks you how he can be sure that there is a God, begin by asking him what evidence he'd need to believe that God exists.
Something objectively defensible. Now, I know that's not very specific, and there's a reason for that because it depends on the exact deity that's being proposed by the believer. My answer for a personification deity, for instance, one that is just an aspect of human emotion or characteristics given anthropomorphic form, that's going to need a different answer from a nature god or a cultural hero like Loki or Prometheus, or, as I suspect he's talking about here, an all-powerful deity like Christians worship. Now, in this particular instance, what would it take for me to believe in the Christian God? Well, their deity would know what it would take to convince me. By its supposed nature, it's supposed to know everything, and therefore it should know what it's going to take to convince me, and as I remain unconvinced, that's a good enough reason for me, at least, not to believe that said deity is real. If said deity existed and wanted me to believe, which is what the religious seem to think is true, then I'd believe. The fact that I don't, that means something. And theists don't like this idea very much, and they can't explain why it happens. They've got a lot of excuses, but nothing that stands up to scrutiny. I wonder why.
You see, the average person will say something like, well, I'd have to see him. To that you might reply, do you believe in air, gravity, love, or intelligence? Have you ever seen them?
All of those things are objectively demonstrable, though. When people say that they'd have to see him, they don't necessarily mean with their eyes. They mean that said God would have to be verifiable in some objective way, and the Christian God in this case, he simply isn't. Then, of course, they start to make excuses for why, well, we can't provide any evidence like that, and it's unfair for you to ask us to try. Thus necessitating the double standard that we've already talked about. That is not a reasonable answer. If you can't provide evidence that I can examine for your God, evidence that I don't have to believe in your God first in order to see, how in the world did they rationally come to the conclusion that their God existed in the first place? And the answer, of course, is they didn't. They used faith and wishful thinking and all of the things that we are not going to accept as rational evidence, and no matter how much they might hope that we just drop our critical evaluation of their claims and just adopt their woo-woo ideas, we're not going to. Here's the criteria: meet it or don't. They can't, so most of the time they just stop talking to us and they just make up stories in their heads about how we're being unreasonable. And I'm sorry, but we're not the ones being unreasonable here. They are.
So is it really fair to use two different standards of proof, one for God and one for everything else that exists but can't be seen? To solve this problem, you can suggest ways that have helped you believe that God exists. The first one is the law of cause and effect.
Except that doesn't work the way that they really wish that it did. In our particular instantiation of space-time, we have observed that effects have causes. That doesn't mean that effects must have causes, only that we've never seen one that didn't. The religious are really bad at understanding things like this. It isn't like we've found the legal codes of the universe written down somewhere that the universe is somehow obliged to follow. Every so-called physical law that we've ever found, they're just observations that we have made so consistently that we assume, for the sake of argument, that they hold true universally. Absolutely no physical law, no observation that we have ever made is automatically infallible. I think it's funny that the religious use this idea that absolutely no effect can ever be causeless until it suits their purposes to pretend otherwise, because they will simply invent out of whole cloth an exception in the place of God. God doesn't need a cause. Why? Because they said so. But this is just appealing to a double standard once again. They aren't holding God to the same standards that they hold everything else to. Why? Because they don't want to. They just can't show why God should get an entirely different set of standards other than their emotional attachment to the idea. Again, how do they know these things, and how have they objectively tested any of it to prove that it's actually so? And the answer is, they haven't. They can't. They just want it to be true.
We use this line of reasoning every day. Whenever we see an effect, we naturally and correctly assume that there's a cause behind the effect. Think of it this way. We believe in the existence of air, gravity, love, and intelligence, not because we've seen them, but because we see the effect that they have.
And also because we can independently detect them through means other than our eyes. Because I don't have to see the air to know that it exists. I can feel it. I can detect it using instruments. I can indeed see its effects, but that isn't the only thing we're left with. So please show us how to do the same thing for your God. Not your interpretations. That isn't worthwhile. How do we objectively determine that your God is actually real in the world that we all share? Go ahead. Of course, we'll never see anything substantive out of them, just a bunch of unsupported claims and wishful thinking, because they have no means at all to show that their deity is real in the same sense as air, gravity, love, etc. They want God to be in a class all of his own, and be immune for any requirement to provide evidence for, and speaking personally, I say no. We have a standard that works, a standard that has worked for everything else we've ever observed. Use that standard. Come on back when you can. Otherwise, you're not impressing anyone.
For example, we see dust blowing and leaves rustling, and we assume the presence of wind. In the same way, I believe in God not because I see Him, but because I see all around me signs that logically point to a great invisible cause whom I believe is God.
But that's the thing. You believe it's your God. Others don't. Others think there are other gods. Others think there are no gods. Others remain unconvinced because none of you people can actually prove your case. How do you determine who, if any of them, is actually correct? Because here's the thing. You are just asserting blindly that the cause that you've imagined in your head is real. Well, how do you know that? Where did you come up with that information, and how have you objectively tested it to see if it passes critical muster? And the answer, of course, is that they haven't. They don't even try. They got their information out of an old musty book of mythology, and it struck an emotional chord with them, therefore they chose to believe it. It was a choice. It wasn't justified. It wasn't validated. It was a choice. They just arbitrarily declared, based on their emotional whims, that, well, it seems okay to me. And people of other religions, they're all doing the exact same thing. Allah sounds good to me. Krishna sounds good to me. Well, they're all doing the same thing, and they're all offering exactly zero evidence for their conclusions. Why? Because they don't really care if any of it is true, so long as it hits the right emotional notes to get them through the day. And I don't care what any of you think. I don't care what any of you believe. I care what you can justify with objectively verifiable evidence. Until you can do that, I'm not interested. And the unfortunate fact is, you people don't have any of that. And that's just sad.
This brings us to our second point, the evidence of design. When I look at my watch, I know that it didn't spontaneously self-assemble or evolve in slow stages from nothing.
That's because you have personal experience with watches. You know that they only come about when humans build them. You can go to the factories and you can watch them being put together. You can do all of this with your own eyes and get the experience that you need. However, you don't have any demonstrable experience with nature coming into being. The simple fact is, there is no evidence for demonstrable design in nature, period. You interpret it that way because you are emotionally attached to the idea. That doesn't mean it's actually there, you just want it to be there. And I love watching these people trying to apply the second law of thermodynamics without understanding what it actually means. Now, to state the law, it says the entropy of isolated systems left to their own devices cannot decrease. But there's a problem, as the religious and most people tend to try to use it. The second law of thermodynamics applies, as should be obvious from the name, to thermodynamic systems. It says that thermodynamically closed systems, and we only surmise one that really occurs in nature, that being the universe itself, and we can't even prove that within such a system, entropy would only increase over time. And you know what is the most perfect thermodynamic system ever to exist? The moment of the Big Bang. Ever since that, thermodynamic entropy has been increasing. Things have been breaking down. You look around and you interpret complexity, but it's not complex, and it has nothing at all to do with the second law of thermodynamics. Most people entirely misunderstand what the second law actually means. They just use it because it fits their purposes, and the people to whom they're speaking, they generally don't know any better anyhow. When are we going to get some reasonable answers? That's what this video promised. I'm sorry, but I'm just not seeing it.
The watch's beautiful design points to a watchmaker. Likewise, looking at the wonders of the universe all around us, we see order, beauty, and design.
We see absolutely nothing of the sort, at least not objectively. Some people interpret it that way because they have an emotionally comforting goal that they want to get to. But based on the science, it's not at all ordered. It might act in predictable ways, but that doesn't mean that there's any design, any more than there's demonstrable design to snowflakes. That's just physics doing what physics does. Then we look at it and say, hey, I like that. But liking it doesn't make it designed. There's a whole lot more that needs to go into that determination that the religious aren't willing or capable of doing. They just want it to be true. Therefore, they declare that it has to be true, all without ever proving that it's true. Because they really don't care, do they? They just don't.
We logically conclude that a beautifully designed watch points to a watchmaker, so it makes sense that an elegantly designed world points to the evidence of a world maker, a designer, who I call God.
It doesn't matter what you call it. It matters if it's demonstrably true, and you haven't come even remotely close to proving it. And this is why the religious, they really don't want to talk to us, do they? They've got all of these bald rationalizations that they've invented in their heads, things that make them happy, but that just don't stand up to any kind of scrutiny in the real world. They expect, or they at least hope, that their detractors will buy into the same level of emotionally laden ideas that have given them comfort, and when we don't, they can't reconsider that their ideas just might be wrong. So instead of doing that, they just withdraw. They talk only to those that they hope they have a chance with, and as that pool of people shrinks, as it invariably is doing today, they just withdraw into their own religious safe space where the only people that they ever communicate with are those who already believe the same things that they do. And then they just make up stories about what might be happening in the outside world so that they can maintain their emotional comfort against the harsh reality that they're in there hiding from. That's why this video is on a channel aimed expressly at the religious. It's not aimed at the skeptics. They haven't found a place where skeptics are likely to happen across it. I can't speak for this video in particular, but I highly doubt that they're out there advertising where the skeptics would be drawn to see it so that we would all go and look at this video. It's purely a "this is why we're right" scheme for those who already believe that they're right. And if they think that we don't understand what they're doing, they're wrong. They just are.
Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa brings us to our third point, the presence of personality. When looking at the Mona Lisa, we can see the evidence of personality and conclude logically that this painting could not have been the result of an impersonal cause.
I love how he thinks he has to tell us that that's not the real Mona Lisa. I mean, exactly who is this intended for again? Yeah, I didn't think it was for us. But when you think about it, that's not really the case either. I can set up an automated camera that snaps pictures of anybody who walks in front of it. Some percentage of those images you might interpret to have personality, whatever you mean by that. But it is the result of an entirely impersonal cause. Because again, this is just individual interpretation masquerading for objective fact when it's absolutely nothing of the sort. As a human, you interpret things as your brain does, as it evolved to interpret things. That doesn't mean that's how things actually are. This is one thing that we see from the religious all the time. They have a real love-hate relationship with humanity. They want to think that we're special, that we're created in the image of God and all that crap, but also that we're evil constantly, that everything we do is constantly an affront to their imaginary friend. Everything out there revolves around us, and that's how their theology came about. Except none of that is actually so in the real world. We are important only to ourselves. When we eventually go extinct, as all species inevitably do, nobody is going to miss us. We're an irrelevant species on an irrelevant planet in the ass end of an irrelevant galaxy. Just because we want to be important, that doesn't mean that we are. Skeptics ask them to back up their claims objectively, and they can't. Because that's not how they're thinking. They're thinking with their fifis and not with their brains. This is the level of rational discourse that they're capable of. And that's sad, isn't it?
Because a cause must always be greater than its effect.
Except that's not true. If I drop a pebble at the top of a snowy hillside, you can get a massive avalanche that is infinitely greater than the pebble that started it. The pebble is not responsible for the massive potential kinetic energy stored in the snowpack. These things are so absurdly simple to disprove, yet the religious are convinced that these are really good answers. Why? Because they never actually expose themselves to the criticism that they get in response and that they so rightly deserve. These are not things that they say to skeptics. Skeptics would eat them alive. These are things they say to each other to convince themselves that their heartfelt beliefs are somehow true and valid, even though they're demonstrably not.
Because the painting evidences personality, so the cause must have personality. In fact, it has to be a person. All around us is a beautifully orderly world filled with people of personality. We reason then that the great cause or designer we spoke of earlier must have personality. In fact, it must be a person that I call God.
I don't care what you call it. This is called defining your deity into existence. There is no evidence offered whatsoever. It's just, here's the bald rationalization that I've constructed, and I'm going to arbitrarily attach this name to it that I find emotionally comforting. If you think that's going to impress anybody, you've got another thing coming. Yet, that's really the problem, because they think everyone ought to be just like they are. They are convinced by emotional claims. Therefore, everybody else ought to be convinced by emotional claims, and they're simply wrong. That's not what's going to convince us. And sadly, that's all that they have at their disposal.
This last point is an important one because a cause or a force cannot hold us accountable, but a person can and will.
And how do they know that exactly? Because for human justice, we have courts and jails and all kinds of things that are demonstrably in existence to hold us accountable to the laws that we make. Now, show that such a thing exists for your God. Go right ahead. This should be fun. Because simply putting the supposed penalty after you're dead and can't come back and tell anybody if it's really there, that's not going to impress anybody either. All the heavens and hells that you can propose, they're not meaningful unless you can prove that they actually exist, and you people simply can't do that, can you? These are all empty claims that mean nothing without independent corroboration, and you have none. That's one of the biggest problems that your side has. Absolutely everything that's happened in this video, it's all been bald rationalizations supported by zero evidence, and you're just tacking on, I call that God, to the end. These are not reasonable answers. This is absolute nonsense. Just because it convinces you, just because it makes you feel good, just because you really wish it was true, that doesn't mean it should convince us. It shouldn't even convince you, but you're not being rational in your beliefs. And that's kind of pathetic.
I'm John Sorensen. This has been Reasonable Answers for Honest Skeptics.
And you're wrong. This is about the time that the apologist simply declares that anyone who doesn't go along with his irrational screed, well, they just can't possibly be honest skeptics, right? Because honest skeptics would automatically agree with this load of emotional bunk. Yet we won't, because you haven't given us anything of substance to consider. This is all just wishful thinking, wrapped up in logical fallacies and, I really wish it was true. But your wishes and your dreams aren't going to convince anyone but you, and let's be honest, they shouldn't convince you either. Not if you are using your rational mind in any demonstrable way. We don't start off with the emotional baggage that you have. We don't wish that these things were true. We'll accept it if you can prove it to us, but you can't seem to produce anything objectively demonstrable. And it's kind of funny how that works, isn't it? I don't care what you want to be true. I care what you can prove to be true, and you've got nothing. Nothing at all. You don't really want honest skeptics. You want gullible people looking for a reason to believe. And that's not us. We need better than you can offer, and you have nothing else to present. So why would we believe anything that you're saying? We shouldn't, and neither should you. The ones with the problems, those are you people. Wishful thinking and emotional desire, that's not a good reason to embrace a position. In fact, there probably aren't many worse reasons that you could possibly come up with. Maybe you need to go back to square one and figure out why you fail. You won't because you don't care, but you're going to get absolutely nowhere like this. It wouldn't have worked in 2016 when this video was made, and it sure the hell isn't going to work in 2022. You're running out of dumb people to con. Maybe you ought to try to be smart for once, because wouldn't that be nice?
Bum